Okay, this is the first time that I'm doing a demo actually on TikTok and much less live. We are hopefully all doing the chocolate chip cookie recipe that I posted on my Linktree. So I've tried approaching this like I used to do demos, but typically you have like a table and a mirror and people can see what you're doing. So I'm going to attempt to go through the process of sort of what I would like you all to do in your homes. And it's just a chocolate chip cookie. So it starts out very basic. And then we'll do what you do in your home. I'll talk a little bit about how I do it, how I break it down, what to think about. But when you are getting any kind of demo that is a basic recipe, you are not looking at the recipe necessarily. You're not thinking about that this recipe is the end all and be all. It's the most exciting recipe that you've ever done. What you're looking at is connection features, things that you can think about that you can apply to your baking and or things that you can do to improve how you work out of your home. I've added this recipe that I posted on the Linktree. I took a gigantic, 20-quart chocolate chip cookie and brought it down to a little over 2 pounds, okay? I do that because when I'm testing, I want to do a couple things. I don't want to waste money. A lot of times when I'm testing cookies, I will not add chocolate chips to them or nuts because those things are really expensive. But for this, it works out really nice, and I'll show you what I made today. I've made this recipe a couple times specifically so that we can talk about this. So this is what the recipe made, -2 actually. So this is a blue scoop. And I had 1 green scoop, which I just baked, and then I had a little guy that I ate. And I know you're not supposed to eat raw dough, but I do, and I did. But these are 8 compacting the scooper. So this is how many cookies I got, and this is what we're gonna do. These are in the fridge to go overnight. The other day I made them, and these are the ones I made the other day. And I made them small in the blue scoop, and they've been in the freezer. So they went in the cooler overnight, and then now they live in the freezer. If I pull them out of the freezer, and I bake a cookie at night. So this recipe is one that I've used for years. It's a melted butter chocolate chip cookie recipe that came to me from a bakery that I worked in years ago. But I also think it predated that, and it's made its way through a lot of different people, and it's really good. Okay, so question is, how long do they keep in the freezer? Anything I put in the freezer, I put a date on, and I just tell myself that it has 3 months. That is for quality, it's not for safety. And I bake these cookies that we are going to make from frozen. So they get in the refrigerator overnight, anywhere from 12 hours to 2 days in the refrigerator, and then they get frozen. As I work, I move from planning, thinking, researching, writing labels, scaling, and then whenever I'm ready, I get going and I mix. So I don't know if you printed out the recipe that I posted on the Linktree, but this recipe tells you so much, not only about this chocolate chip cookie, but about a lot of chocolate chip cookies. So on this, I wrote notes, and some of them say that you begin with printing the recipe and keeping notes and doing research. So I have, and it's going to be backwards, but this is out of my file folder cabinet. It says chocolate chip cookies. So I have cookies, and then I have a whole file of chocolate chip cookies. And I haven't looked at these in a while, but what I did is I went on my computer and I took out the highlights. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, like 25 chocolate chip cookie recipes. All the most famous, from the Hershey's, Toll House, Valrhona. And I did this like 3 years ago just for fun, I think in the winter. And you can see I went through and I changed all of the amounts to grams, and then I put them into my spreadsheet. And what I did today is out of curiosity, because I didn't have time to get them all into a new spreadsheet, is I went through them to see what the similarities were. Because I've been making this cookie recipe and then I get nervous, like, are people going to complain because they don't like the recipe or it didn't work for them? It's the kind of cookie that not only was sold in a bakery, so that means that a lot of people can execute it, but I taught it to my beginning professional baking students, and that meant that it could be executed by a lot of people. So it's easy to make. It has 57% baker's percentage butter in it, and 17% egg and 5% egg yolk. And then the sucrose is around 33% with 67% brown sugar. Now that's just a lot of numbers, whatever. I get it's boring. But if you look how I did, and this is how I think visually, I compared the ones that were closest in the yellow highlighter, and today's doesn't really stand out. It's close to others that are popular. And then the outliers are some interesting ones. You know, like there's a New York Times, they do like a crinkly one, a fast one, a regular one. And you start to notice where these people push the numbers around. But here's a crazy thing. Betty Crocker, Nestle Toll House, and Hershey's are literally, their sucrose and brown sugar are all 53% and 59%. Literally, they're the same. When you're looking at these recipes and thinking, you know, what makes them unique or what am I looking for? I mean, there's a lot to talk about, but they begin to look more alike than different, which I think is really interesting. So for my research, what I do is I grab a bunch of people that I love. I might print out their recipes. I might go through and convert a bunch, kind of take a look at them. I read articles about it, not just about the history of the chocolate chip cookie, but what other people say makes a really good chocolate chip cookie. And I start to formulate an idea of what I want it to be. So you're going to do some research and you're going to print and pull the things that you like. And then you're going to describe the ideal, whatever the ideal is of that recipe. For this recipe, I already know it's going to be sweet, moist, thick, chewy in the center, and then hopefully the edges will spread out to the point where they get crusty and dark. That's where the flavor starts to come in. So when you look at the recipe, we have how to make it, some best practices and things to think about, the ingredients, and then up here you have the ingredients, and then we're working off of this 100% batch right there, that amount. These ounces and pounds are just for estimation purposes. I found a lot of times if you're going to the store and you need to buy what you need for your baking, it's kind of good to conceptualize it as pounds and ounces for those of us who live in the States. But then over here, you're going to look at the percentages, and flour is always at 100%. So these numbers that you're looking at, these percentages, as you become familiar with the percentages of a recipe that you are testing or experimenting or loving or thinking about, you're going to start to look for recipes that are outliers. So if you convert your favorite recipes that you found online or in books to grams, and you put them in and you do baker's percentage, which is to take the weight of an ingredient and divide it by the weight of the flour, you will get the percentage for baker's percentage based off of flour being 100%. That is all to say that there's a lot you can do if you want to recipe develop, if you really want to dive into your favorite recipes, and if you want to tweak them just a little bit. Because when you get into these hundredth of percentages and you think you want just a little more salt or a little more baking soda, you're not just going to add a teaspoon or a quarter teaspoon or an eighth. You're going to look at these percentages and then begin to move things around by a half a gram, whatever. So if you find this cookie doesn't have the flavor you like, and that's what will be fun about this experiment, you make this cookie. And if you don't love it or if there's things about it, use it as a guideline, because I'm actually so familiar with it. You could send me questions that you changed the brown sugar and, because you wanted it to be softer, but this other thing maybe happened. And you can start to troubleshoot it and understand how real recipe development happens. Okay, so this is what I work with. I made the recipe a couple times. The first time I baked it, I took a ton of notes. Second time, I took more notes. I know this recipe like the back of my hand, but it doesn't matter. I diagrammed it out. And again, this is something I've done a million times. So this recipe has AP flour in it, baking soda, and sea salt. You're going to sift that. And you don't have to sift it at the beginning, and you'll see when I do the method that you don't have to. The butter gets melted. I melt it in the microwave, but you can melt it on a stovetop or whatever. But you don't melt it all the way. It's like chocolate. You leave a little bit and let nature take its course and get it to almost all melted and then set it aside. And the temperature of the butter can matter. So if you're putting in a pot and bringing it screaming hot, that's not good. But if you're just gently melting it in the microwave and there's still solids in there, you're going to be fine. And then we have the sucrose and the brown sugar, which get paddled. That's the first thing that happens in the bowl. And I say paddle because this is a paddle in the bowl on the mixer. Now you can use a hand mixer for this recipe if you would like. It's very forgiving. And in fact, if you want, you can do it by hand, but you might not get the emulsion that you need, but it's pretty forgiving. Once you paddle your melted butter and sugars, you are going to add back and forth dry egg, ending on dry, just until it's combined, and there's a lot of nuances in there. And then you're going to add your chocolate chips, and then you're going to scoop it, refrigerate it, and then freeze it before you bake it. So when we start to talk about ingredient function, we have some things in here that make this recipe interesting. And I did find one recipe had cake flour and bread flour. So they were trying to do this. This recipe has AP flour. AP flour has 11.7% protein. And so that's right in the middle of bread flour and, a pastry flour. So it's going to give you structure. There are things that live inside the flour that you need to hold your cookie together. And AP flour, or all-purpose flour, gives you those things. So I use a butter that's 83% fat. In that butter lives, as you know, proteins, solids, and the solids have sugars and proteins, and the sugars are lactose, that's a dairy sugar, and water, and then fat. When you melt this out, like we're going to do, you're going to create a different cookie that has chew. So you're not going to be creaming it like normal. When you paddle melted butter with sugars, you are going to get a different texture of a cookie. One fun thing to do if you wanted to test this recipe 2 ways is to make it once, leaving the butter unmelted and creaming it, and then make the cookie that way and compare it to the melted. Completely different, very interesting, and something that you can try. So I break all of the ingredients into categories. The butter is my fat. Some fats, when you make a cookie, could be olive oil. They could be shortening, but we are using butter as our fat and it's unsalted. Our sugars, typically with a chocolate chip cookie, are sucrose, which is table sugar, and brown sugar. Now, I found in my research that there were cookies that were 100% brown sugar. And that's going to give you a lot more flavor, and it's going to change things. The less brown sugar you have, the more regular sucrose you have, the crisper your cookie is going to be. Then we have eggs. And in my cookie research, half of the recipes had just eggs, whole eggs, not the yolk. So what you get out of these ingredients is, like, out of your egg, you get structure. In the egg, you have proteins that build structure. In the flour, you have starches that build flour. In the egg, you have water. And in the egg yolk, you have lecithin. Lecithin is going to help make things a little bit creamier, but a yolk is going to cook and give you structure before it gives you creaminess. So a lot of adding a yolk is an insurance policy against a dry cookie, which you aren't going to have with this. So I kind of like the combination of the whole egg and the yolk. So I diagram it out after I read through any recipe. Even if I'm familiar with the recipe, I diagram it out, because sometimes you forget, and then if you make a mistake, you're going to frustrate yourself. Okay, so first I will convert things to grams, and then I will make labels. I use these acrylic sheets. I put the stickers onto the sheet, and then I write them out. I put them onto my deli cup lids, and then I use the lids to scale all of my ingredients. And I'll show you what I have. These are my ingredients. These are the ingredients for this recipe, but these are the eggs and the butter. And if I wanted to make this tomorrow, these would go in the refrigerator and these would stay out. I have the brown sugar wrapped because it likes to dry out, but these are my ingredients. The reason that I scale this out is so that I can compare holding the recipe to these ingredients and confirm that I have it right. So I can take either this that has the instructions on it or this, and I can tape it to my wall so I can look at it while I'm working. I can also put it into a sleeve, a plastic sleeve, and I can take notes on it. So again, if you're interested in doing any kind of recipe development, you're going to want to keep notes as you move along. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is gather any tools that I need. When you work efficiently, it means that you have an area set up, you've sanitized everything, you've gathered the tools that you need, you have your pre-scaled ingredients, they're all at room temperature, and when you begin, you are focused in a way that means you probably won't be making as many mistakes. You'll be able to stay on task, get it done. So I call it go time. Anything you do before you begin working, it just doesn't matter. You can have a good time in your kitchen, but when it comes time to work is when you need to pull your hair back, wash your hands, get your apron on, focus, and get it done. Because once it's mixed and you're beyond the stage where you can make a mistake, then you can go back to relaxing. And I listen to music when I work, but I don't watch shows while I'm trying to focus. And when I was teaching in person, I would tell people that when they were scaling and when they were actually working on a recipe to not talk. Sometimes when people would stand out as being chatty, I would say, if you make a mistake, we're going to go, but like when you make a mistake, you want to go back and figure out what happened. So you go back to your scalings, you go back to your process, things like that. If you were chatting, it becomes sort of like that's probably what it is. And that is why when I make videos, I do them the way that I do, because I spend my time really focusing on a good outcome and paying attention. I have a long history of when I goof around and when I don't pay attention that I make a mistake. So I know best for me. So that's what I recommend. So that's how I get to this point where I have my tools ready to go. So this is my sifter, and they come in different sizes, and I use this size. This is what I use not only to line my tray, which looks nice, I use it as a way to pour ingredients into the bowl, but I also sift onto it, and this is a half sheet tray. And so this fits. So I'm going to look for a sifter that's smaller than the width of my parchment. And this will help me to stay a little bit neat and organized. I like to keep 2 spatulas close by. I just keep everything right here within reach. So I usually have 2 spatulas nearby. The green scoop is a classic size for a cookie. It gives you big enough that it'll end up nice and thick. You could sell it. It doesn't seem scant. This is what a lot of bakeries use, unless you're using like a gray scoop or a bigger one to make a giant cookie. So these are my 2 favorite, and I think using a scoop like this is really vital to getting everything even. When you pull your pan out of the oven, there needs to be airflow. I really like that I have this IKEA shelf, because these racks, like I put this on here, I just baked this cookie. It's cool now. Doesn't it look good? And I can just put it on here and it gets a lot of airflow. But the cooling process is just as vital and as important as mixing and baking and everything else is. You have to cool your stuff properly, and airflow is key. So I always have some kind of cooling rack nearby. And then there are as many theories about how you could bake and what trays you can use as there are recipes. So I like to get a frozen cookie on a moderate heat in the oven where it starts to melt. The inside's frozen so it stays solid, and the outside starts to melt. So it could be a combination of a Silpat and a tray, or it could be a parchment with 2 trays. When you stack 2 trays together, there's air between here that creates slower heat transfer. So you're going to get a little bit more spread if your oven temperature isn't too high. As soon as my cookie starts to spread and get just slightly brown, I turn the oven down to around 295. Now I check the oven with an oven thermometer and make sure, because ovens can be wildly off. And I've had ovens where I've shown up to work and people have said those ovens, they don't work. And just by adding an oven thermometer in different spots, you can kind of drive the oven. When you are baking a cookie, and you want so desperately to have someone tell you that it needs to be baked at 350, for 12 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever. I just can't and won't do that. You have to get in touch with your oven and your product and know that you have a goal in mind. So if you're going for a crisp cookie and you have a convection oven, that's great. You're going to want more heat transfer, not a silpat, and you're going to want something like this configuration. But I really like the silpat, and I like a double pan that gives me the spread that I need. So I am using these Ghirardelli chocolate chips. I have found this 60% to be so nice. And I used to at work have Cocoberry Calibo chocolate chips, and those were fine. But I just really didn't taste around. I didn't test around. But now that I'm here and I have all of these other brands going, I started tasting them individually and was shocked at the subtle flavor differences. And I'm just not a huge fan of the Nestle. It tastes chalky. It doesn't have great flavor. But this Guittard is really, really nice, and it's vegan. And this is becoming more popular in the United States, but it's definitely available online and around the world. And it's dairy-free, which a lot of you are looking for, and the flavor is really good. But I love this in a gluten-free brownie or something like that, or if you're going for vegan. But for this cookie, I really, really like and can recommend these Ghirardelli 60%. They are a little bit bigger than a regular chocolate chip, and they get really glistening when they go into the dough, which you will see. I just love them. So I highly recommend the 60% Ghirardelli, and you can get that at the grocery store. I'm going to wash my hands and change my clothes here. It's cold where I live, so I wear overalls to keep warm. Aprons are meant to be worn in the kitchen when you're working, not to the bathroom and not outside. They're meant to keep your clothes clean, and they should be clean and sanitary for the food that you're working with. I'm going to sanitize the countertop really fast, and I never spray any kind of disinfectant anywhere near the food. I'm going to do it over here, and then I'm going to wipe the counter down with a natural disinfectant. All right. So this cookie recipe is on my link tree, and it's in grams, and that makes it easy for you to adjust if you need to. You can make it bigger or smaller. And all right, here we go. So I take my diagram that I made and I lay my ingredients out the same way that they are going to be added together and used in the bowl. So I'm going to start with the fat and the sugars, and I'm going to stack them. And then I have the dries, which are the flour, baking soda, and the salt. And then I have the eggs, and then I have the chocolate chips. At this point, I can take the tray away and make room. Okay. All right, so I am going to open my brown sugar. I never scale brown sugar in advance because it gets hard. As I open all of my ingredients, I take my labels and I put them right here on the countertop. Believe it or not, if you make a mistake and you have a really elaborate recipe and you have these, you will know if you missed something, because you never know what's going on in the kitchen, and it's sort of like a nice record of what's going on. Here's something else I need to tell you. So I need to double check that I have the right amount. So for the butter, I have 153 grams, sucrose 90, brown sugar 180. AP flour is 270 grams. And just so you know, like, I scale these, but I also have internalized how big the containers are typically for 270 grams of flour. If this were only this much, I would be like, huh, so that's my brain second and checking and cross-checking what's going on here. Anyway, 270 AP, 4.5 sea salt and baking soda, and I use a mini scale for these guys because it's under 20 grams. I put these together because I'm going to be sifting those together. And then the eggs, I have 45 grams of whole egg, and 14 grams of yolk, which I also, because it's under 20 grams, use my mini scale for. And then what's cool about this system also is, look, this is 180 grams of chocolate chips. That's 349% baker's percentage. It's quite a bit, and it kind of, just by looking at it, I can kind of tell. So now that I have these out and I've verified that they're a right amount, I can just get rid of this. Even though I've done this a bunch, I hang it right here so I can see it. So we have butter and the 2 sugars. That's fat and sugars. Like I said, I use the microwave to melt my butter, and I am going to leave the lid on so I don't get it all messy in the microwave. I'm going to start with 30 seconds. So as you can see, hardly anything happened, and I'm just going to pop it back in for another 30 seconds. And I know some of you are going to say that these deli cups aren't meant to be microwaved, and you are correct. I'm just melting them a little bit. Otherwise, I could transfer it to a bowl, but my training is to not add any extra dishes. No extra dishes are allowed. So I'm going to cut this at 15 seconds, and you can see it's starting to melt. And there are many chunks in there, and I'm just going to give it another 15 seconds. And then rather than keep going, I'll let nature just take its course and finish the melting while it sits on the counter for a second. Okay. Clean all the butter off the lid. And you can see that some of the solids have sort of sunk to the bottom and the fat's risen to the top. I don't need to stir it, I'm just noticing. All right. So in my kitchen, everything is really, really cold. So it crosses my mind that this butter is warm, but I don't want it to get shocked. So instead of worrying about it too much or warming up the bowl, I'm just going to keep things moving. So as soon as I add the butter, I'm going to begin to add the sucrose, followed by the brown sugar on low. And I wish I had an overhead mirror. Maybe I'll be able to get a cool setup at some point. So all the butter is going to go in here. I've had this mixer since my daughter's 30. I got this mixer from my grandfather when my daughter was 6 months old for Christmas. He gave it to me in support of my baking interest. All right, so I'm going to turn it on, and then I'm going to slowly add the sugars. Brown sugar. I don't ever add everything all at once. I like things to get to know each other slowly. And again, when I talk about paying attention, for me, it means that I'm not distracted. I'm not distracted by a million things going on, because if anything goes wrong, I'm right here and I can see it. And when you look at the ingredients that you're using, they add up. So I just like to know that I'm on task. You can see that it's oily. Very oily because the butter is liquid and there's a lot of it. There's a large percentage. So when I talk about creaming regular butter with sucrose, it's different than having melted butter. That doesn't mean that you can't add air, and if you have a greasy mess, you can emulsify it just by turning up the mixer and letting it work. I'm going to take the parchment and the sifter, and I'm going to add the flour first, the baking soda and salt on top. And I really am into not touching the ingredients. Really nice restaurants count the number of hand touches that food has during the production process. and that degrades the finished product. So I make it a habit and a practice to not touch. So I will use a dry spatula to finish getting it out of here, but I'm going to keep it on the parchment. And sifting is not just to aerate, sifting is to begin the cohesive process, which is what you want to do when you're baking. Every step that you're working is getting these ingredients to blend, to mix together. So people often ask, do you have to sift? Is it necessary? It is not 100% necessary, but if you look at all of the little ways that it affects your final product, it becomes necessary. Is your flour dense? Has it been packed and is it lumpy? Did my baking soda have lumps, which it actually does? So I use this parchment like a funnel, and then the parchment gets used not only for me to put the raw cookie dough on, but I use it to bake, and it gets reused many times. So now that I have my dries, I'm going to get my eggs ready. When things aerate, you're adding oxygen so they get lighter in color. Can you see how much lighter in color that is? And if you do not want to overmix something, that's where scraping becomes your friend. I scrape a lot because if you want things incorporated, it's a low friction way of incorporating them. All right, so I'm just going to turn it on low. When you are worried about overmixing anything, it is not necessarily at the stage where you're adding your sugars and your fats. It's once you add flour and the flour is exposed to moisture, because then you start developing gluten. So this is not going to be overdone, but the second I start adding my flour, I have to be thinking, should I stop the machine? Is it on low? Have I overmixed it? And I need to really be paying attention to not overdoing it. I'll get my chocolate chips ready, which I'll add last. Alright, so I'll just do it with the mixer on. But basically, with your parchment, if you hold it in two spots, and if you buy cheap parchment, this could break. I've had bad parchment at work before that doesn't hold up. This is your on-off. So I can pour a little bit in and then lift this up, and that's off. And I'm going to do it in thirds. So the first third is going to be my largest, then the second, and the smallest will be my third. So I'm going to work, I'm just estimating, but if I do this, that stays clean, okay? And I will show you what it looks like. This is what it looks like. There's flour on the edges of the bowl. And if I were here by myself, I would stop and add the egg, half of the egg, and keep moving. But if you stop your mix and just scrape, you're not hurting anybody, and you are helping to get it more cohesive, and you're not overworking the gluten. So I'm going to turn it on low and then stop it, because if I keep the machine on while I'm scraping the deli cup, I don't know, there's a chance I could be overworking it. And then I'm just going to push a little bit in here. Again, just thinking, how can I move things in a direction where they're combining, but I am not overworking them. So there are a lot of ways to get to the same conclusion. Okay, so then I'm going to look in here until the egg is mixed in, and then I'm going to add, with the mixer running, the next third of the flour. It's going to get moistened, and then I'm going to stop and add the yolk. There isn't much, so I definitely want to stop the mixer and go ahead and take the time to get this all out of here. 14 grams is not much, but it's really about the percentage, but every bit matters. I do a lot of scraping that when you watch my videos is not included, because it adds a lot of time. All right. So I'm gonna mix this just a little, and then I'm gonna scrape the bowl. And sometimes I bang it and just turn it up for 1 second. And then I will go ahead and show you. Now, if we were creaming regular butter and sugars together, this would be twice as big. So I'm going to take the paddle and just go around and clean up my bowl. And there are still pieces of flour that you can see, that I can see, so it doesn't need to be perfect, but there's no need for me to get full cohesion right now. I add the final flour, and I will go ahead and just put it in without the machine on. Get my chocolate chips. I like this dough because it's kind of dry and it pulls away from the sides of the bowl. So I will show it to you. You can already see how it's really a nice, non-sticky, and that really is the high butter content percentage that's giving me that texture. I'm gonna scrape all the dry parts off the bowl, and you can see this is still a mess. And I'm going to look on the bottom and make sure that I've cleaned it up. But I'm not going to do it on the mixer. If you keep going and you overwork a cookie, it's not the end of the world. There are ways to mitigate it. You know, you can bake it at a lower temperature. You can use a Silpat, insulate the pan, create an opportunity for a little more spread. But if you keep going, you will tighten up your cookie and it will not spread as much when it is on the pan. Conversely, if you were to use regular butter and cream the butter and sugar and you creamed it really long and gave it a lot of air, you'd get a lot of spread, which is nice. Sometimes that's what you want. So at this point, I'm going to pull my ingredient labels because I know I have everything I need. You can save these. I have been in situations where I've been in the garbage pulling them out, which sounds crazy. It was usually an exam situation. So I'm going to turn this on low, add the chocolate chips, pulse it a little bit, and there you go. That's it. So baking is not about one answer. It is truly about looking at what ingredients are in your recipe. What job do they do? What other ingredients live in your ingredients? And what jobs do they do? Because when your ingredient has a job in one thing, that job might be different in something else. Egg whites are doing different things in this cookie than they are doing in a meringue. All right, so I'm gonna move my mixer. And this is what we have. Let me see if this is a little closer into the light. It's a really nice dough, okay? And you can see how it doesn't stick. It isn't runny, it's firm. That's the melted butter. All right. So I'm gonna go back to using my green scoop because I like the size. And I'm right-handed, so I'm gonna organize it so it's efficient. I always work near me and away and very routinely as a habit so that when it matters, like when you're rolling yeast doughs and you need to keep track of how old they are, it's a practice that you have developed. And I like habits because they pay you back over time as you switch different skills. So I like a cookie that's craggy, and I noticed that the last time I made it, it was very smooth. So there are a lot of ways to scoop cookies, and I was thinking about how do students do it and what because they always were good. And I know that a lot of people like to really push the cookie into And so anyway, if you notice something about your cookies that you don't like, this is a step that you can actually consider. Do you need to change it? So I do kind of keep an eye on where the chocolate chips are. I give it a good press and I scoop up along the side of the bowl, always at the same spot. And so while I estimate how many cookies this recipe will give you, depending on how you actually scoop your cookies, how much pressure you apply, and that sort of thing is going to affect your eventual yield. And that's where variation will come in. And it sounds silly, but if you assign this to people and you're at work and one person says, I was supposed to get 150 cookies and I only got, 130, it's like it could be just because of different makeup techniques. We all do things a little bit differently. And again, none of this really matters when it's just you in your home. But anyway, there we go. So I don't add salt to a cookie now. I wait until right before I bake it. And I really like to add either a crunchy Maldon salt or something, or just a little bit of kosher salt. Let's see. I don't label everything with the name if it's obvious, but I always put a date on. And I know that sounds like, well, it's just you. Why would you need to put a date on there? But as with everything, you think you're going to remember, and I just really don't think you are. So I put a date on here so that I know if something happens tomorrow and I forget that it's been in the refrigerator since now. And I don't have the time, but I do have the date. So I buy these bags. They're called bun bags. This is a half sheet bag, a half sheet tray, and this is a quarter, okay? So I'm going to put it in this direction, and I reuse these. You can tell this has been used a lot. Might actually be beyond its best use. But I don't want to smush the cookies, and I don't want to put them in the refrigerator without being covered because they will dry out. So if you think about what you do at every stage, whether it's to add moisture, add air, incorporate things, if anything you do after that negates the work that you put in, then you've lost what you were trying to do. So if I put these in the refrigerator without any covering, and I could wrap it with plastic wrap lightly, but I don't want to smush them, or if I just put them in the freezer thinking I'll knock the warmth out of them and get them chilled really fast, I'm going to lose moisture. It's just not a best practice, but it's completely up to you. So I wrap these, I put the date on here, and this goes in the refrigerator. And then tomorrow I will transfer these to a Ziploc, label it, and put them in the freezer. But this step of refrigerating a cookie is so vital. Let me explain. If you skip it, go right to the freezer, it won't happen as well. When you make a cookie, if you baked it right now or if you tasted it, it would taste good. But it's just like with gelatin or any other ingredient like yeast. You cannot force things to do things they don't want to. These ingredients, which is the moisture, is going to make an exchange with the sugars, and the flour starches. And the exchange of moisture is necessary to release all of the properties. So if you've ever noticed that your cookie is crumbly and you didn't allow it to rest overnight, it's not just resting, because we did activate the gluten. It's the hydration, and it's oftentimes time, temperature, and moisture. So the moisture is a really important aspect of any cookie to pay attention to. So I tend to obsess all of these details. I think that they're important because I believe that those subtleties make a difference in the texture and the flavor that people notice that they might not even be able to articulate. But it's the difference between why when you go to one bakery and you taste something and it's ephemeral, and you go to another one and it's good but it's not that memorable. That's the difference. But I think right now there's enough information in terms of how to scale, how to read the recipe, how to think about how you're going to do it, rewrite it, scale it, mix it, refrigerate it, and freeze it. And you can either, and what's great about freezing it is for fun, you can go ahead and bake off one or two. And you can try the different pans or temperatures and you can play with it because you'll have around 10 to 12 cookies. And then on Sunday, you'll come informed. And then when I talk about baking it and kind of bring you through that and answer all your questions, because Sunday will be about all of your questions, you will have some skin in the game, you will have some understanding of what's going on, and you'll know what questions to ask. So I baked mine at 345 for about 10 minutes, and then I turned my oven down to 295, and I open the oven and bring the temperature down, not all the way to 295, but close to 300, and then I roast it. I'll tell you one other thing that I do. I do like a craggy top, and you can use a spatula or whatever, but I take a knife once it's spread and before it starts to set, and I give it a couple of dinks to create surface space. That's why you'll see these here. I like to get those so that the flavor kind of is in there. So let's see what the cookie looks like. This is the cookie. This is the bottom. It's got nice color. This is the back of the cookie. Doesn't that look nice? It's shiny. It's not greasy. It's not greasy on here either. So it's really yummy. And that's about how thick it is. See how it's thick in the middle and thin around the edges? So then I'm going to break it. And this, you can see like all the chocolate chips, so yummy. Can you hear it? Oh my gosh. Ooh. Oh, okay, there you go. So you can see some air cells. There's some air cells. You see a darkness that's creeped through the bottom just a little bit. I like that color. If I were grading this isn't an A, but it's pretty good. I like that there's some crinkles on top. There's a good distribution of chocolate. I could lower the amount of chocolate, but I would only do that if I didn't like this much, but I do. And you can tell it's smooth. It's not grainy. It's a very tender cookie. And it has a nice break. And these will stay soft all day because of the melted butter. I think that's beautiful. It's got nice air on the inside. This is soft. See that? Soft. But then it's got a nice crunch to it. So I think this is a pretty good cookie.